I would not have made a move if it wasn't for that. If 10, 20 million people did not see him say the everlasting whip my. There was no call for it, dog. If you didn't want to be in the beef, then you should have stayed out of the beef. You shouldn't have opened your mouth with an opinion. That's it. So that's why I dissed him.
There was a time when Snoop Dogg and Eminem weren't just collaborators. They were brothers in rhyme, united under the same musical godfather, Dr. Dre. Their chemistry was electric, their respect mutual, and their loyalty seemingly unbreakable. Both were molded by Dre's vision. One, a West Coast icon with a laid-back swagger. The other, a white kid from Detroit, whose rage and wit reshaped hip-hop. Together, they represented two sides of the same revolution. NBUT, as history has often shown. Even the tightest alliances in music can unravel in seconds. NBNTHE's spark that lit this feud didn't come from betrayal in the studio or business gone wrong. It came from something far more human: pride. In 2020, during what seemed like an ordinary interview, Snoop was asked to list his top 10 rappers of all time. Fans expected to hear Eminem's name among legends like Tupac and Biggie. But what came next shocked everyone. Snoop calmly dismissed Eminem from his personal list, claiming that without Dr. Dre's production, Slim Shady wouldn't even be a contender. It wasn't just the words, it was the tone. That cold, casual dismissal stung harder than any diss track could. NFOR Eminem, a man whose entire identity was built on respect earned, not given. This was a dagger. Coming from Snoop, a friend, a mentor's protege, someone he saw as family, it felt like a public betrayal. Eminem had been silent for most of his career's criticism. He'd been called too angry, too white, too controversial. But Snoop's words weren't from an enemy. They were from within the circle. And that made it personal. Then came the response, subtle, yet surgical. In his track, Zeus, from the deluxe edition of Music to Be Murdered By, Eminem dropped a line that froze the hip-hop world. "Last thing I need is Snoop Dogg me." It wasn't an explosion. It was a warning shot, a reminder that even legends could bleed if they crossed him. The verse wasn't filled with venom. It was laced with disappointment. The tone suggested not anger, but heartbreak. For Eminem, this wasn't about ego anymore. It was about loyalty that had quietly died. NNSNOOP, ever the cool-headed veteran, brushed it off. He called it family business, insisting the media had blown things out of proportion. But beneath the calm exterior, fans could sense the fracture. The brotherhood once built under Dre's roof was gone. In interviews that followed, Eminem explained that it wasn't just Snoop's opinion that hurt, it was the disrespect in his delivery. It was more about the tone he was using, Eminem said. Like, "Yo, where is this coming from? I just saw you." NNTHAT, one statement revealed everything. This wasn't a feud born from hate. It was born from confusion, from a friend blindsided by another's indifference. As the years passed, both artists moved on professionally, but that invisible tension never truly disappeared. They'd stand together again during the Super Bowl halftime show in 2022, a symbolic reunion that had fans hoping the Cold War was finally over. And maybe, in that moment it was. But history remembers what the heart forgets. NNTHE Snoop Eminem fallout wasn't just another celebrity spat. It was the unraveling of a legacy friendship, proof that in hip-hop, respect is a currency more valuable than fame. The two men who once stood side by side as brothers had turned into wary allies, separated not by beats or bars, but by pride. In the end, Snoop Dogg and Eminem's feud wasn't about who was the better rapper. It was about what happens when admiration turns into disappointment, when words meant for the world end up wounding the ones closest to you. And in a world built on rhythm and rivalry, that might be the deepest cut of all. Long before Eminem became a global symbol of lyrical ferocity, he was part of an unpredictable, experimental musical era, a time when rap rock reigned supreme, and Limp Bizkit's frontman, Fred Durst, was one of its loudest voices. The late 90s were chaotic, raw, and loud, and for a brief, shining moment, Eminem and Durst stood shoulder to shoulder, pushing boundaries together. Their collaboration on the remix of Turn Me Loose and appearances in shared studio sessions hinted at a creative chemistry rooted in rebellion. Both men were outsiders who rose to fame by flipping the bird at the establishment. NBUT, in the volatile world of fame, alliances can crumble faster than a beat drop. And this one did, explosively. And it began with a man named Everlast, a rapper-turned-rocker who had once been Eminem's friend, but later became one of his most vicious detractors. Their feud spiraled out of control when Everlast mocked Eminem's family, prompting M to fire back with "I Remember" and "Quitter." In that lyrical crossfire, Fred Durst and Limp Bizkit found themselves in a dangerous spot, right in the middle of someone else's war. And at first, Fred tried to stay neutral. He'd been cool with both sides, and hip-hop beefs weren't exactly new to him. But then came DJ Lethal, Limp Bizkit's turntablist, who made a fatal comment during a radio interview, claiming Everlast would mop the floor with Eminem in a fight. That offhand remark detonated like dynamite. Eminem, who viewed loyalty as sacred, felt betrayed. He had expected Durst to step in, to defend him publicly. Instead, Fred remained silent. In silence, in Eminem's world, was louder than any insult. Within weeks, Eminem responded not with a phone call, but with a diss track, "Girls." The song was raw, mocking, and venomous. He accused Limp Bizkit of cowardice, calling Durst a sellout, and mocking their music as empty noise compared to his own lyrical depth. He spat lines dripping with sarcasm, making it clear that anyone siding with his enemies would be treated as one. Fred Durst, true to his defiant persona, didn't respond musically, but he wasn't about to take the humiliation quietly. He fired back in interviews, laughing off Eminem's anger and suggesting that Slim Shady was too emotional. In one particularly biting jab, Fred implied that Eminem's tough persona was all performance, that behind the rage and the bleach blonde hair was someone craving attention. NTHE Public ate it up. What had once been a promising partnership turned into a full-blown spectacle. Fans took sides, hip-hop blogs fanned the flames, and MTV fueled the narrative of two rock-rap titans turned enemies. NBUT beneath the public feud was something more fragile, the sense of brotherhood that fame had corrupted. Fred Durst had once admired Eminem's rawness. Eminem had respected Fred's hustle. Yet both men were victims of the same disease that haunts every star at their peak. Ego. Limp Bizkit's career began to decline soon after, while Eminem's star only rose higher. He went on to become one of the most decorated rappers of all time, while Fred's legacy was buried under the rubble of early 2000s nostalgia. Still, Fred occasionally mentioned Eminem in interviews, sometimes with regret, other times with indifference. Eminem, on the other hand, moved on, but never forgot. NTHE Fred Durst feud wasn't the longest or the loudest in Eminem's career, but it was one of the most symbolic. It exposed a side of fame that rarely gets seen, how friendships built in the spotlight often collapse under the weight of ego, pride, and perception. Fred and Eminem were both rebels who fought the system until they started fighting each other. What began as creative chemistry turned into creative combat. And when the smoke cleared, both men were left standing, but their alliance, once a symbol of unity between rap and rock, was gone forever. And in the end, it wasn't music that broke them apart. It was silence, pride, and the painful realization that even in a genre built on rebellion, loyalty can be the first casualty of fame. In the late 1990s, hip-hop was an arena of gladiators, lyrical warriors battling not just for fame, but for respect. Every verse was a weapon, every metaphor a declaration of dominance. And somewhere within that storm stood two rising forces. Eminem, the raw wordsmith from Detroit, and Cannabis, the lyrical prodigy hailed as one of rap's purest talents. And at first, there was admiration. Eminem respected Cannabis's intricate rhyme schemes, his scholarly flow, the way he could lace bars with double meanings that made even veterans pause. Cannabis, in turn, saw in Eminem a fearless poet who dared to blur the line between comedy, violence, and truth. They weren't rivals, yet. They were artists chasing the same crown. Authenticity, NBUT in hip-hop. Misunderstanding can be fatal. It all started with whispers. Rumors that Cannabis believed Eminem had secretly written LL Cool J's bars in their legendary feud. The story was false, but it spread fast, infecting the underground like poison. Eminem, who built his identity on self-expression and honesty, took it as a slap in the face. To accuse him of ghostwriting for someone else, especially LL Cool J, wasn't just an insult. It was a challenge to his integrity. Eminem reached out, hoping to clear the air. But by then, Cannabis had already started firing subliminal shots in interviews and freestyles, questioning whether Slim Shady's fame came from real skill or shock value. Eminem's reply came not in words, but in art, through the sarcastic, self-aware humor of Role Model and the darker edge of Square Dance. Both songs carried undertones of mockery, coded messages that only true hip-hop heads could decipher. Cannabis didn't back down. He doubled down. In tracks like You Didn't Care and Second Round Knockout, he called out Eminem directly, branding him fake, manufactured, and protected by Dr. Dre's influence. It wasn't just a diss, it was a philosophical war about what real hip-hop meant. Was it about lyrical purity and street credibility, as Cannabis claimed? Or about boundary-pushing innovation and emotional honesty, as Eminem embodied? NTHE feud wasn't as publicized as his later battles, but it burned deep in the community that truly mattered, the lyrical underground. Fans dissected verses, argued over metaphors, and debated who stood taller as a writer. And while both rappers had skill in abundance, Eminem had something more: momentum. As Eminem's star exploded with the Slim Shady LP and the Marshall Mathers LP, Cannabis began to fade into the shadows. His albums, though lyrically sharp, couldn't match the emotional gravity or cultural reach of Eminem's confessional chaos. The industry had chosen its champion, and it wasn't him. Cannabis, bitter and bruised, later accused Eminem of blackballing him, an allegation Eminem never acknowledged. Yet the irony was poetic. The feud that began over questions of authenticity ended up defining both men's identities. Cannabis became the underground purist, respected but misunderstood. Eminem became the global megastar, constantly accused of selling out but forever defending his art with brutal honesty. In interviews years later, Eminem rarely mentioned Cannabis by name, but his tone whenever the topic surfaced was one of disappointment rather than anger. He had wanted peace, but hip-hop doesn't reward silence. It rewards survival. Their battle was less about hate and more about legacy. It wasn't two men trying to destroy each other. It was two artists trying to prove who deserved to define what real meant in a genre built on authenticity. And in that silent contest, one truth emerged. Authenticity in hip-hop isn't about where you're from. It's about what you're willing to reveal. Eminem revealed everything. Cannabis guarded his truth too tightly. NBY, the time the dust settled, both men had scars, one emotional, one reputational. Yet their clash remains one of the most intellectual and tragic rivalries in rap history. A battle not for fame, but for identity. By the early 2000s, Eminem wasn't just a rapper, he was a cultural lightning rod. His words didn't just entertain, they provoked, polarized, and pierced through the safe walls of mainstream pop. Every lyric felt like a match tossed into a gasoline-soaked room. But when one of those sparks landed on Moby, the quiet, bald-headed face of electronic music and moral commentary, a different kind of war began. This one wasn't about street credibility or lyrical superiority. It was about ethics, art, and the soul of modern music itself. And at first glance, Moby and Eminem couldn't have been more different. Moby, the soft-spoken vegan activist, built his career on introspection and ambient melodies. He was the poster child of underground integrity, someone who made music for thought, not chaos. Eminem, on the other hand, was hip-hop's chaos incarnate. He thrived on outrage, wielding profanity like poetry, and wearing controversy as armor. Their worlds were never meant to collide, and yet they did, spectacularly. It began when Moby publicly criticized Eminem's lyrics in the early 2000s, particularly their violent and misogynistic themes. During an interview, he called Eminem's music, quote, dangerous, claiming that it encouraged hatred and normalized abuse. In another statement, he accused the rapper of hiding behind irony to justify cruelty. For Moby, it wasn't personal, it was principle. But for Eminem, who built his art around the idea of freedom of speech and emotional truth, it was an unforgivable offense. Eminem didn't just disagree, he detonated. On his 2002 hit Without Me, he aimed his venom squarely at Moby, mocking him in a verse that became instantly infamous. You 36-year-old bald-headed fag, blow me. It was crude, offensive, and completely on brand for Slim Shady. The insult wasn't just meant to hurt, It was designed to humiliate. The audience laughed, cheered, and replayed the line endlessly. In one brutal stroke, Eminem had turned Moby, the intellectual, into a punchline. NBUT. Moby didn't respond with music. He didn't drop a diss track or even a line. Instead, he did something that infuriated Eminem even more. He refused to play the game. Moby simply said he felt sad that Eminem had chosen to attack him. No anger, no bravado, just quiet disappointment. And that calm defiance, that refusal to engage, only stoked the fire. When the two men crossed paths at the MTV Video Music Awards later that year, tension buzzed through the room. Eminem heckled Moby from the stage, taunting him as the crowd looked on, half in shock, half in delight. The feud wasn't just a battle of words anymore, it was a cultural moment. On one side stood the artist who believed art should reflect chaos. On the other, the man who believed art should heal it. And in hindsight, their clash represented something larger than either of them. Moby and Eminem were symbols of a divided era, the moral conscience versus the unapologetic rebel. Moby's criticism struck at the heart of Eminem's creative philosophy, that art should never be censored, even when it offends. Eminem's response, meanwhile, exposed how deeply he internalized judgment, how every moral critique felt like a personal betrayal. Years later, Moby admitted he had no hard feelings. He even said he understood Eminem's anger, describing him as a brilliant artist who was struggling with demons. But Eminem never publicly apologized. In his world, words were weapons, and to take one back was to admit defeat. Their feud, unlike most in hip-hop, wasn't about ego, it was about ideology. Moby questioned whether art without empathy could still be meaningful. Eminem argued that empathy without honesty was hypocrisy. And in that philosophical deadlock, both men were right and wrong at the same time. It was a clash between morality and mayhem, between the man who whispered truth and the man who screamed it. And though the battle ended years ago, its echoes still linger. A reminder that sometimes the deepest wars in art aren't fought with fists or beats, but with beliefs. In the shimmering pop universe of the early 2000s, Christina Aguilera was the golden voice of empowerment, a rising icon of confidence, control, and undeniable talent. Eminem, on the other hand, was the firestorm threatening to burn that same universe down. Their worlds weren't meant to clash. One sang about self-love, the other rapped about rage. Yet somehow, they collided in a feud that became one of the most talked-about cultural clashes of its time. A brutal confrontation between misogyny and female defiance, between the real Slim Shady and the real Christina Aguilera. And it started innocently enough, almost flirtatiously. Eminem had mentioned Christina in early interviews, calling her cute and even hinting that he had a little crush. At the time, both were young, famous, and at the top of their industries. But when fame meets pride, even the smallest misunderstanding can explode into war. During an MTV special in 1999, Christina made what she thought was a harmless comment. She mentioned that Eminem was married to his longtime love, Kim Mathers, and, perhaps without realizing it, implied that their relationship might have its ups and downs. It was gossip, casual celebrity chatter, nothing out of the ordinary for MTV in the late 90s. But to Eminem, it was a violation. Someone digging into his private pain for the sake of entertainment. And if there's one thing the world should have known by then, it's that Eminem never lets a slight go unanswered. In 2000, he dropped The Real Slim Shady, one of the most iconic and controversial songs in pop culture history. It was hilarious, outrageous, and venomous. And right in the middle of it, he name-dropped Christina Aguilera. The line wasn't just a jab, it was a lyrical grenade. Eminem accused Christina of certain explicit acts with fellow pop stars and painted her as a two-faced opportunist. The world gasped. MTV replayed it endlessly. The crowd cheered. And Christina? She was mortified. NTHE feud instantly became front-page news. Pop radio hosts took sides. Some saw it as harmless satire. Others saw it as character assassination. Christina was no stranger to criticism, but being mocked by one of the biggest rappers on the planet in front of millions was another level entirely. In interviews, she tried to take the high road, saying she was disappointed that Eminem would attack her so personally. But behind that composure, the wounds were deep. And then came Can't Hold Us Down in 2002, Christina's musical counterpunch. The anthem was a fierce, unapologetic response not only to Eminem, but to the entire culture of male dominance in the industry. With lines about double standards and silenced women, she reclaimed the narrative. It wasn't just a song, it was a statement. While Eminem's diss had been born from anger, Christina's response was born from empowerment, and it resonated with millions of young women who were tired of watching female artists be targets for mockery. And ironically, as the years passed, both matured and perspective softened the edges. In 2018, Christina addressed the feud once more, calling it, quote, a crazy time, and admitting she had moved on. She even expressed understanding, saying that Eminem was in a very different headspace back then. Eminem, too, later hinted in interviews that some of his old lyrics crossed lines he wouldn't cross today. Though he never directly apologized, his silence spoke volumes, a rare concession from a man who rarely conceded anything. Their feud became a cultural marker, not just of early 2000s celebrity chaos, but of a shifting era in gender politics. Christina Aguilera refused to play the victim, and in doing so, she changed the tone of female empowerment in pop. Eminem, meanwhile, learned that even the sharpest tongue has consequences, and it was a war of words that exposed the fault lines of fame, where every lyric, every soundbite, every offhand comment could ignite a global firestorm. Yet, in the end, both survived, both evolved, and both proved that sometimes the fiercest battles create the strongest artists. If there was ever a feud that crossed every line imaginable, it was Eminem versus Ja Rule. This wasn't just rap beef, this was all-out war. A battle that dragged families, friends, and reputations into the fire. What began as a rivalry between Ja Rule and 50 Cent spiraled into something much darker when Eminem stepped in, not for fame, but for blood loyalty. In the early 2000s, Ja Rule was a dominant force. With Murder Inc. ruling the charts in hits like Always on Time and Livin' It Up flooding the airwaves, Ja was the smooth-talking, radio-friendly rapper who had successfully blended hardcore swagger with R&B glamour. 50 Cent, on the other hand, was the hungry newcomer, raw, unfiltered, and rising fast under the wing of Dr. Dre and Eminem. When 50's Wonksta mocked Ja's credibility, the shots were fired and the lines were drawn. Eminem initially watched from the sidelines. He had his own battles, critics, pop stars, moral crusaders. But this one hit closer to home. 50 Cent wasn't just an artist he signed. He was a brother in arms, part of the Shady/Aftermath family. And when Ja Rule retaliated by going after 50, he made a fatal mistake. He brought Eminem's family into it. In a shocking diss track, Ja Rule crossed the uncrossable. He insulted Eminem's daughter, Haley, dragging her name through the mud in one of the most vicious lines hip-hop had ever heard. For Eminem, that was the ultimate provocation. Haley wasn't just his child. She was his anchor, his reason for surviving addiction, poverty, and fame. Mentioning her wasn't just disrespect. It was war. Eminem hit back with a vengeance. His response came in the form of Hail Mary remix, a lyrical ambush alongside 50 Cent and Busta Rhymes, modeled after Tupac's haunting classic. The message was clear. This wasn't just music anymore. This was retaliation. Then came Bumpheads, a blistering barrage aimed directly at Ja, mocking his credibility, dismantling his image, and questioning his authenticity line by line. The energy in Eminem's voice wasn't the usual sardonic humor. It was fury. He was defending his family, and in Eminem's world, that meant total annihilation. NTHE feud turned brutal, spilling off records and into the streets. Fans divided sharply between camps, and the press documented every barb. Ja Rule, once untouchable, found himself battling not just Eminem, but an entire powerhouse of hip-hop's elite. Eminem, 50 Cent, Dr. Dre, Busta Rhymes. It was David versus an entire army of Goliaths. And for the first time in his career, Ja looked vulnerable. And as Eminem and his allies flooded the airwaves with disses, Murder Inc. began to crumble under the combined weight of musical backlash and legal trouble. Federal investigations into the label's finances added pressure, and Ja's star began to fade. Eminem, meanwhile, emerged untouchable, not just as a lyricist, but as a protector. Fans admired his ferocity, his willingness to go nuclear when someone crossed his line. Years later, when the smoke had cleared, Eminem reflected on that period with a mix of pride and exhaustion. He admitted the feud had gone too far, that mentioning families should have never been part of the game, but he never forgave Ja Rule. The pain of hearing his daughter's name in a diss track was a wound that never fully healed. NJA Rule, for his part, tried to frame the feud as a misunderstanding blown out of proportion, but the damage was done. His career never fully recovered, while Eminem and 50 Cent went on to dominate the industry. NTHE Eminem-Ja Rule feud remains one of the most personal and vicious in rap history, not because of clever punchlines or chart-topping tracks, but because of what it revealed about Eminem's core. Behind the fury and fame was a father, fiercely loyal, dangerously protective, and willing to go to war for the people he loved. And it wasn't just about respect. It was about blood. By 2012, Eminem had already survived more feuds than most rappers could dream or dread. He'd battled legends, critics, and ghosts of his own past. He had nothing left to prove, but fate has a cruel sense of irony. And his final great rivalry came not from an equal, but from a fan, a young, brash rapper named Machine Gun Kelly, who grew up idolizing him. What began as admiration twisted into defiance, sparking one of the most explosive and public rap feuds of the modern era. NTHE First Shot was fired quietly, a single tweet. In 2012, MGK posted that Eminem's teenage daughter Haley was hot as F-Tom***, though he added that he meant it in the most respectful way. The damage was instant. To Eminem, that respectful add-on meant nothing. His daughter was off limits, always had been, always would be. MGK might have been young and reckless, but he had crossed a sacred boundary. Still, Eminem didn't react immediately. For years, he said nothing publicly, though rumors swirled that MGK had been blacklisted from certain platforms connected to shady records. In interviews, MGK hinted at feeling silenced, and that resentment began to fester. To him, this wasn't about Haley anymore, it was about recognition. He saw himself as the next generation, the hungry underdog in a world dominated by legends who wouldn't give up their thrones. And Eminem? He saw MGK as just another upstart trying to make a name by picking a fight. NTHE tension simmered for 6 long years. Then, in 2018, Eminem released Kamikaze, an album filled with rage and reflection, a lyrical exorcism against critics, haters, and imitators. Buried among the firestorms was a verse aimed straight at MGK, a cold reminder that Shady never forgets. The track, Not Alike, took surgical aim, mocking MGK's flow, questioning his courage, and reminding him and the world, who still ruled the mic, and MGK didn't back down. In fact, he did the unthinkable. Just days later, he dropped Rap Devil, a direct and daring diss track aimed at the rap god himself. The title alone, a play on Eminem's rap god, was pure audacity. Over a haunting beat, MGK accused Eminem of being bitter, insecure, and out of touch. He mocked his age, his legacy, and even his beard. It was bold, disrespectful, and, for a moment, effective. The internet exploded. Fans were divided. Could the student actually dethrone the master? Eminem's response was swift and surgical. Just 1 week later came Killshot. The name said it all. The track was calm, calculated, and devastating. Eminem didn't scream. He didn't rant. He dismantled MGK piece by piece, mocking his career, his bravado, his fleeting fame. One line after another, he buried him under precision-crafted bars, the lyrical equivalent of a sniper's bullet. When he spat, "You sound like a whiny baby, so let's talk about it." The message was clear. This wasn't a fight between equals. It was a lesson. Within days, Killshot broke YouTube records, amassing tens of millions of views. MGK tried to play it cool, tweeting that the song was trash, but the damage was undeniable. His rap credibility began to crumble under the weight of Eminem's precision. Soon after, MGK pivoted, trading rap battles for guitars, shifting into pop-punk. To the world, it looked like surrender disguised as reinvention. Years later, both men would downplay the feud. MGK claimed he'd moved on, calling the fight a moment in time. Eminem, ever the tactician, dismissed him with a smirk, calling the beef done. But to fans, it was more than a moment. It was the last great lyrical war of its kind. Raw, public, and unfiltered, NTHE Eminem MGK feud closed an era. It wasn't about streets or betrayal or industry politics. It was about legacy, the old guard defending its throne against a challenger too young to understand what he'd unleashed. In the end, MGK learned what so many before him had discovered the hard way. When you go after Eminem, you don't get a fight, you get a finish. And with Killshot, Eminem didn't just win the battle. He sealed his legend as the last man standing in the art of lyrical war.